We're now starting to see that kind of interplay between, kind of online threats merging into physical threats. And we talk a lot around kind of, security controls or mitigation. That's when the incident has already happened and the horse has technically already bolted at that point.
So what does the future of security look like? Welcome to today's podcast, where we break down how security is evolving in a world that doesn't slow down. Today's conversation is simple but critical. We aim to unpack the statement, why traditional security is no longer enough. To do this, I'm talking to Colin, the Intelligence Director at Global Protect Risk, who help organisations to stay ahead in understanding the risk and the threat posed by the current digital landscape. Colin is here to share his expert knowledge in this space. For years, security has been built around control, and the reality is most organisations aren't underprepared, they are just preparing for the wrong things. Firewalls, access systems, policies. And while those are still important, they are no longer sufficient, because threats today don't follow rules. They don't break in anymore, they blend in. Colin, what do you think are the fundamental changes in traditional security today?
Good question, Wendy. I think fundamentally, the biggest shift has been in the threat surface itself. And we can break that down into a number of different areas, really. I mean, I think firstly, information is everywhere. And we start to focus around the kind of our digital footprints, and much of the critical information that, a malicious actor might gather about our organization is typically already online. I think secondly, probably the boundaries between threats have definitely shifted. When you start to think about the fact that work is now, in some cases, hybrid. People are working remotely. They could be using personal devices, that's laptops and telephones. And then I guess as well, access to work systems is pretty fluid now because of that kind of shifting dynamic in our kind of working environment. And I guess thirdly, I would say that threats are now blended. We're starting, where we used to see things that were specifically physical threats to our buildings and threats to our people. We're now starting to see that kind of interplay between, kind of online threats merging into physical threats, as they kind of move from either kind of like online social media trolls that present that kind of physical threat, or, online reconnaissance that kind of informs the kind of attack vector that those individuals are going to use. And I think a lot of traditional security infrastructure within our organizations has typically tackled each one of those threats with, excellent teams of experts, but very much focused on their disciplines. And that can lead to a kind of, an org chart that's very siloed. And I think our ability to pass information between those teams is where the challenges lie.
And what do you think the biggest mistakes are that organisations are making today?
I think in terms of mistakes, I think it's, I guess there's two areas I would focus on. I think one is quite often traditional security has been very focused on incidents, but that puts us in a frame of mind that's very reactive. And we talk a lot around kind of, security controls or mitigation. But again, that's when the incident has already happened and the horse has technically already bolted at that point. I think there's been a shift towards being more predictive. So that's, more reliance on kind of analytics, looking for indicators and warnings. And I think that's a kind of new space for us to look into. Now, I kind of understand that actually security is probably one of the hardest places to demonstrate ROI, when it comes to, budgeting and kind of dialogues around the board table. I think traditionally the metrics for success has always been, either incidents that have been, resolved or mitigated against. But I think we're now kind of in that space where we can start to look at, the absence of incidents is actually the demonstration of value. And I think that's a difficult mistake to rectify, is that how do we shift perspectives in that space?
So what does the future of security look like?
Again, a good question. I mean, I think one of the things we've kind of discussed previously was, in mistakes that are made, we've kind of often focused on those mitigation solutions. And that could be everything from, the physical security space, but there's been a tendency to shift ourselves towards, finding that kind of unicorn tool, that single pane of glass that's going to resolve all of our issues. I think as we start to unpack those blended threats, I think our responses to security challenges has to be similarly blended. How do we take elements of our cybersecurity team, our physical security team, and other areas of the business? So things like the HR team have a direct influence in how we mitigate and kind of tackle issues that might arise around things like insider threat. Which bucket does insider threat kind of sit into? And I think the future is really in those kind of blended teams coming from different disciplines. And we're really talking about how we can do really efficient information management. So we're not just super reliant on alerts. How do we start to share information that's more focused around kind of early indicators, shifts in behavioural patterns? And I think that interface with even things like HR are a really interesting space as we move forward.
I think it would be useful to give some real life examples. Can you put what we've discussed in this episode into real life scenarios?
Unfortunately, yes, we've got some really good examples, I guess, of where security might not have quite hit the mark. I can think of a couple of examples where it hasn't necessarily been an incident that's kind of been derived from an obvious hack, a cybersecurity incident, or a perimeter breach, in a sense of hostile actors trying to gain physical entry to a site. Some of the more recent examples, where we've seen really prominent UK, British brands that have been subject to targeting through quite sophisticated actors. Quite often, the kind of source of that security incident has come from social engineering, essentially. That could be everything from those individuals gathering kind of breached and leaked credentials online. It could be as innocent as the kind of sharing of information on social media platforms, whether that's a tagged post detailing where the executives are traveling to. I can think of a really recent example where people have used fitness apps, which might not give away location data. I think a lot of people, including malicious actors, are very aware of where potentially sensitive sites are. But what it does give away is that kind of pattern of life and that kind of profiling of the individuals. A lot of these kind of fitness apps will have a start and end point, which could be a home address, or does that individual travel on a piece of military equipment? Thinking about the recent kind of French aircraft carrier that were through the Strava app, people were able to kind of track locations around that. But again, it's not necessarily around location data. It can be around that kind of collateral, kind of digital exhaust, as they call it. All those kind of little nuggets of information around your pattern of life that might be left online.
Yeah, it's quite frightening, isn't it? How much is out there?
Yeah, and I think it's the sum of the parts that make it kind of really interesting. It could be as innocent as the type of mobile phone apps that are on a device, and that can leak those kind of real interesting little pieces that when you put them all together, that jigsaw puzzle can build a really compelling picture for malicious actors.
What are your thoughts about security in the current threat landscape?
I think in the current landscape, it kind of alludes back to that conversation we had around the kind of traditional structures. I think it really isn't just about control measures anymore. It's how do we manage, anticipation of threats and risks. Again, it's going back to that kind of, how do we provide predictive intelligence as opposed to just reporting information or yesterday's news. Yesterday's news is great for things like, trend and pattern analysis, but we need to use that information to help us identify indicators and warnings of potential threats that are coming down the kind of downstream.
And we've discussed the security concerns in the modern world, but my final question is in two parts. How is Global Protect Risk helping organisations to navigate these? And what would be your expert advice to our viewers or audio listeners?
So rather than advice, I guess I would pose a few questions to people listening, and that's kind of, do we understand what's publicly visible about our organisations? Have we done that kind of digital vulnerability assessment to gain a bit of insight as to what's out there, essentially, and whether that's potentially informing those blended threats. A real area that I'm quite passionate around as well is, how are we tracking behaviour incidents? I think most security organisations are really good at producing those incident reports. But where are we sending those reports to? Are we doing that kind of pattern and trend analysis around it? I think that's a really vital part, and who has ownership of where that information sits. And then I guess the kind of final question really to the listeners would be, how would we respond to a risk in real time? I think there's real value in asking those difficult questions around the board table. Let's run some exercises, test out some of these potential risks and threats that we see out there, and work out just exactly where lines of communication lie, who has responsibility for some of those blended threats, because it's that ambiguity that people are exploiting. And I think the more we can rehearse that before a security incident occurs, the better.
Security is evolving, and the question is your organisation evolving with it? If you want to explore how your current systems hold up or where your blind spots might be, start with analysing visibility, because you can't protect what you can't see. We are Global Protect Risk. I'm your host, Wendy, and in this episode I've been talking to Colin, bringing you intelligence insights that no one else is talking about. Thank you for joining me today, Colin.
Hey, thanks, Wendy.
Click on the link in the description to contact us. Let's start the conversation before someone else does it for you.